Still not sure whether you should continue renting or buy a property? Well, I recently spoke to Cape Town-based conveyancing attorney Meyer de Waal, who not only shared how renting could cost you millions of rands over time, he also advised how people who are currently renting can go about getting into the property market. Take a look. Meyer, welcome back to All About Property.
Thank you, Cornelius.
Now, I'm particularly excited about chatting to you today. Firstly, a lot of people out there don't know whether they should rent or purchase a property. And you've done an in-depth study on the pros and cons of each. And secondly, even though people know that purchasing a property is probably the better idea, they don't have the know-how. And you're going to share some products around that and on how people can empower themselves to become homeowners.
Absolutely.
But before we get into all of that, let's first understand what are the advantages of renting a property?
Well, the biggest advantage is that you can live in a better place, maybe a fancier place than buying your own property. The reason for that, it's cheaper, more affordable to rent a property than going out to buy a property. You only need a deposit to put down, and you need to demonstrate affordability that you can pay the rental to convince the landlord to sign a lease agreement.
Are there any long-term advantages to renting?
I haven't found any long-term advantages because in the long term, your rental will escalate either 8 or 10% every year. And if you take those calculations, then it actually just boggles the mind why anybody wants to rent or actually committed to rent, because I've done a calculation on 10,000 Rand a month rental. If that rental escalates over a period of 20 years, that's the same time it takes somebody to pay down his bond. That 10,000 Rand a month will cost you 5.2 million Rand over 20 years.
Now, let's talk about owning the property that you live in. I mean, as you rightfully said, there's much more costs involved to it. You pay your monthly bond installment, which is much more than you would have paid rental on that million rand property. There's rates and taxes, there's levies, there's maintenance costs. Talk to me about these so-called disadvantages of owning your own property.
It's not a disadvantage, it's more a cost of your investment. So you've got to calculate the difference in your investment. How much money will you pay in? So therefore, if you do investment, work out what are your disadvantages, as you call it, or maybe it's actually more than the money that you have to pay in. So if you're renting, you're going to pay a flat rental of 7,000 Rand a month. If you're buying, you're paying back on a million rand, 10,000 Rand a month, plus another 1,000 Rand towards rates and taxes and all those things. So for me, I always look at investing in a property is how quickly will I break even? And if you call it a disadvantage, it's more for me of an opportunity cost.
Now let's look at, still on the topic of owning your own property, and let's compare it to, as you mentioned earlier, if you rent over 20 years, you end up paying 5.2 million Rand. But if you, and using the same million rand example, but if you own that property, what would the financial picture look like over 20 years?
Well, it all depends on where did you buy the property. It depends on the growth in the area over 20 years. But over a long time, you'll find that the value of a property increases, your purchase price increases, and your installment maybe stays stable, and there you find that the value of a property starts to outstrip the expenses that you had initially, and it definitely outstrips the increase in your monthly rental if you were to be a tenant for the rest of your life.
So in short, over 20 years you've paid off this property, so you now own nothing on the property, plus the property increased in value, so you've got this property that you bought for R1 million that's now 20 years later probably worth 2 million Rand, and you owe nothing on it.
Absolutely, that's what the holy grail that you are striving towards.
Now, I think a lot of South Africans understand, yes, it's probably important to own a property, but let's face it, not everyone's got the means I mean, if you buy a million rand property, you need to have at least 150,000 rand in cash, 10% for your deposit and the rest for transferring fees. But now you have got a product called Rent to Buy Finance, where you're saying, but you don't have to pay all that money. Here's a different solution. Do you want to shed some light on that?
Rent to Buy Finance was brought in exactly to assist people that do not have a deposit. And the deposit requirements are much lower. When you buy from a property developer, you most likely find that your deposit will be about 3.5% of your purchase price.
3.5%. That's a huge difference from the 10 to 15%.
Absolutely. So there's a massive, the barriers to entry are completely reduced. If you buy from a private seller, then the deposit is roughly 6% to 6.5%. Again, that's quite often half of a deposit that a bank and the conveyancing fees that you have to cover for will be required. So the rent to buy is definitely a way to get your foot in the door. A lot of people will tell you, do not buy right now, but save. And we're definitely in favor of saving towards a deposit. Yes. But the problem lies, if you have to save towards a 15% deposit, by the time when you have your deposit available, it's 2 years later. Then the prices have escalated so much that you're always playing a catch-up game.
And how would people get in touch with Rent to Buy Finance?
Well, they can go to our website. They can go, it's www.i with a dot on rent2buy.co.za.
And Meyer, then there are a lot of South Africans who would probably not even be able to afford that 3.5% deposit. These are South Africans who earn sometimes less than 10,000 rand. And for these people, you also have a solution to become homeowners. Do you want to shed some more light on that?
The government has a subsidy out there that's very lightly or lowly promoted. And this is called FLISP, F-L-I-S-P. It stands for Finance Linked Individual Subsidy Program. And this subsidy can be used for a first-time buyer as a deposit, as conveyancing fees, bond registration fees. So immediately, home buyers that earn under 22,000 rand or up to 22,000 rand have access to this subsidy.
Well, Meyer, thank you very much. That was really very insightful.
Thank you, Cornelius.